set, tapes rolling.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Inside View. My name is Cory Burnell and I'll be your host. And this is part 4 out of 4 episodes that we're doing with our representative, Tom McClintock. And Congressman, thank you again.
Again, a pleasure.
We've been spending some time together today. And
marathon.
Yeah. So for our viewers, if you haven't seen any of the first 3 episodes, do take a look for those on YouTube. And we're going to be discussing the coronavirus pandemic and the things surrounding that today. So, Congressman, this is probably one of the things most top of the mind for our viewers right now. That it's the thing they're experiencing on a daily basis, right? Everywhere we go, we're going to be reminded that we're part of this right now. So, as you see, new scientific studies come out. What policy changes are being discussed in Washington, and do you think that maybe even at the state and local levels ought to maybe change from what we've learned over the last 6 months?
Well, it's the state governments that have done the damage.
That's right.
Enormous damage. I truly believe this will be looked back upon within just a few years' time as the most self-destructive policy fiasco in the history of our country, possibly in the history of the world. What we know about COVID, first of all, you go back 6 months and remember, we were enjoying the most prosperous period in our lifetimes. Economic expansion, which was bringing up wages dramatically, particularly for working class Americans, lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, lowest unemployment rate for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for women in the history of our country. And then we began these lockdowns over COVID-19. Now, what does the science tell us, and what did the politicians do? They're complete opposites. The science tells us that it has virtually no threat to children, but it does pose a very serious threat to the elderly. So what did the politicians do? They closed our schools, and they packed infected patients into nursing homes, which is where we've had roughly half of the deaths attributed to COVID-19. The science tells us that it is very rare for this virus to be transmitted outside. 80% of transmissions are within people's homes. What did the politicians do? They closed the beaches, the parks, and the forests, and they ordered people to stay at home. This is insane. Lockdowns like this have never been attempted in the history of civilization because of the enormous damage that they do. They haven't saved any lives. I mean, if you recall, a few months ago, Andrew Cuomo had to admit that 84% of their COVID-19 hospitalizations, 84%, were people who were already locked down. They were either at home or at nursing homes. 84%. You look at, there have been 8 states that did not shut down, 42 that did. Wall Street Journal ran a piece on this about 6 weeks ago, and they pointed out that the states that did not lock down have a lower mortality rate from COVID-19 and only half of the economic damage of the states like California that did lock down. Side-by-side comparison, look at Colorado and Utah, 2 states that share a border, similar climate, similar topography, similar demography, similar balance between rural and urban areas. Colorado locked down its population. Utah didn't. Utah's got about half the mortality rate of Colorado and half of the, and half of the unemployment rate as Colorado. And you see the same thing internationally. You remember Sweden was so viciously attacked because they made the decision to stay open. They kept the schools open. They sheltered their elderly, but otherwise they went about their lives. So did the Netherlands. And Sweden was always attacked for having this sky-high mortality rate. Well, you take a look at the mortality curve for Sweden and for the Netherlands. It's your typical Ferris viral curve. From the first day of deaths to the peak day of deaths, 33 days in both countries. Okay. And then a steady decline. It's been over for several months in both of those countries. In the last 7 days, Sweden has recorded no deaths anywhere in the country from COVID-19. The Netherlands, a few weeks ago, issued a mask advisory to its citizens, telling them not to wear masks. The unemployment rate in the Netherlands now is 4%. In California, it's 14%. Now, remember I said it was from the first day to the peak day of deaths, 33 days in both countries. Here in California, which was brutally locked down, it was 142 days from the first death to the peak deaths. And we're still recording hundreds and hundreds of deaths a day when it's been virtually over for the last several months in countries like Sweden and the Netherlands. That's a tragedy. And that doesn't, so nobody was saved by these policies. But we haven't begun yet to calculate the enormous number of deaths. The Wellbeing Trust estimates there will be 75,000 deaths of despair because of these lockdowns. They describe deaths of despair as suicides, drug and alcohol abuse. I was talking to a Placer County sheriff who says, you know, people are freaking out over 70 COVID-related deaths in Placer County. Nobody seems to give a damn about the 613 teenagers that have tried to commit suicide in the same period. The deferred health screenings that have gone on for months mean that we're going to see highly elevated deaths, preventable deaths, because people couldn't or were too scared to go to the to get their normal health screenings. And then you look at the CDC's study, actually I believe it came out of Columbia University, but paid for by the CDC, which estimated that about 4.5% of all deaths in this country are poverty related. Well, we've just thrown 40 million Americans out of work.
Right.
So the damage has just been extraordinary, and now we're learning if you're otherwise healthy and under 50, your chances of dying from the seasonal flu are greater than dying from COVID-19.
Yeah.
And here's the real kicker, and you look this up. Just don't take my word for it. Now, when I saw this, I said, this can't be right. I said, I told my staff, you go take a look at this one. This one doesn't pass the smell test. Comes out as true. If you're otherwise healthy and under 15 years old, your chances of being killed by lightning are greater than dying from COVID-19. Wow. Average age of death in this country from that disease is about 80 years old, give or take a year or two. This has been a monumental policy fiasco. It has done incalculable damage to our economy. It has not only not saved lives, it has cost lives. And at some point, the politicians who ordered these policies need to be held accountable. Nobody voted for this. Nobody voted to lock down an entire civilization. The legislature didn't even pass a law. This traces to specific acts by specific people. I won't mention his name, his initials are Gavin Newsom, and people like him need to be held accountable.
Well, all the way along, we're told, well, we'll let science dictate policy. And so I want to question, I'll bring up some of that's just come out recently. The CDC on August 26th released data showing that only 6% of all COVID-19 related deaths listed the coronavirus as the sole cause of death. Right. 94% of these, what's listed as a COVID-19 death, had on average 2.6 other underlying causes, what they call it, conditions or causes. Right. You know, the New York Times just ran 3 days ago an article called "Your Coronavirus Test is Positive, Maybe It Shouldn't Be." And it found that in Massachusetts, New York, and Nevada, up to 90% of the people testing positive, these are the PCR tests, had barely any virus at all, really just viral fragments that were not contagious. So here...
Well, and we've known for a long time, 80% of people who get this either don't know they have it,
Right.
or they experience it as a mild head cold. You know, I'm personal friends with Louis Gohmert, who is big publicity over his being diagnosed as positive. Well, he's going to get on Air Force One. They do an instant test there. It comes back positive. He has to drive. He can't get on a plane now.
Yeah.
So he's got to drive himself all the way back to Texas to get home. And he says, I was feeling fine till the end of the drive. Then I was really starting to feel it. And I said, what was it like? He said, it was like 2 days of having a mild flu. And
well, the
he's
sensitivity
in his 60s.
here with the PCR test, you know, the notion that science has perhaps been manipulated a bit to impact policy, because these things have what are called cycle thresholds, and what the New York Times was reporting is that the tests were running 37 and 40 cycles, which apparently the sensitivity was extreme. So if we were to find that, okay, the United States has close to 600,000 reported cases right now, but if only 10% of those were legitimate due to these tests being essentially oversensitive, we have absolutely responded poorly with policy, as you're bringing up here. I mean, there's no place we could be down. Did I say 600,000 or 6 million total cases? We'd be around 600,000. You know, effective, worrisome cases. And so what would you say to Americans who are looking at this November election as a bit of a referendum on what's happened to them the last 6 months?
I mean, just ask yourselves, do you want to continue into this dysfunctional, dystopian society that the left has created? Joe Biden promises more of that. He said he'd lock down the country in a moment when an expert tells him. Well, experts have the luxury of not having to worry about the consequences. They can look at one tiny little sliver of a reality and take no responsibility for anything else. And by the way, not all the experts agreed or ever did agree on this. There were highly respected teams at Stanford University, University of Southern California, Oxford University that were saying this is getting blown way out of proportion. This is the equivalent of a bad flu season, which by the way it is. You go back to 1957, you'll find the Asian flu pandemic killed 116,000 Americans. That's out of a population at the time about 180 million. So if you do the population adjustment, that'd be the equivalent of about 223,000 Americans dying today. Nobody remembers the Asian flu pandemic of 1957 because the Eisenhower generation didn't freak out. They recognized it as a nasty bug, they coped with it, they got over it. Everybody remembers Sputnik from 1957. Nobody remembers the Asian flu pandemic. So those experts were right, but those are not the experts that the left listens to. The experts the left listens to are those that want to do the maximum amount of damage to our economy, the maximum amount of damage to people's livelihoods, and freedom be damned.
Yeah.
And so he's already said 3 months of mandatory masks, even though there are a lot of studies that show that cloth masks are virtually useless in stopping aerosolized viral particles. If you look at the filtration ability of a cloth mask compared to the size of the actual viral particle, one epidemiologist described it as trying to stop a mosquito with a chain link fence. There are studies that show them 97% ineffective at stopping aerosolized transmissions, and yet Joe Biden wants to mandate masks for the next 3 months. They do stop droplets, but droplets only transmit about 1 meter. And droplets normally are accompanied by coughs and sneezes. And if you're coughing and sneezing, you're symptomatic, and you probably ought to stay at home. Well, or at least cover your cough or sneeze, the way your kindergarten teacher and mother always told you to do.
Yeah. Well, and with policy prescription here, was originally we were told we needed these policies in order to dampen a curve so that medical systems weren't
to flatten the curve. That was it. 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Yeah.
Yeah, and so have we seen anywhere in the country other than with Cuomo's mismanagement in New York City where healthcare systems have been at risk of being overrun, or have any of those materialized?
Don't forget, we build to a certain level, and beyond that, we cope. So during a heavy flu season, you see ICUs filling up to near capacity or over capacity. And there were some instances across the country there, but very, very few of them. And in fact, most of them, they cleared out ICU beds. And again, that's where your deferred health screenings, they stopped, they call them elective surgeries. Elective surgery is not plastic surgery. Elective surgery is something that is not an immediate emergency. Everything from hip replacements to any number of hernia operations.
Yeah.
I had one colleague tell me of an instance in Ohio where the guy was in so much pain from a hernia that he could not get treated because it was considered elective. He killed himself.
My goodness.
I mean, it's just outrageous. At any rate, yeah, a complete lack of common sense in addressing this from the start to finish. And I'm a little upset with the president for bringing in Anthony Fauci, who I think did a terrible job.
Mm-hmm.
But the president didn't order national lockdowns. Those were ordered by governors, most of them left-wing Democrats, and the worst of the lockdowns were the most leftist of the Democrats, and that includes this state. And they did enormous damage, and people got to ask themselves, do you want to continue down that road? Because that's exactly what Joe Biden and the Democrats are promising. More lockdowns, more closed schools, and another 3 months of wearing masks that the science says are 97% ineffective at stopping transmission of aerosolized particles.
Well, right here in California, Gavin Newsom's talking about these policies being in place until there's a vaccine.
Yeah.
And again, the policy has changed here.
Well, and remember, promising a vaccine and delivering a vaccine are two very, very different things. Now, there have been some encouraging developments on that front, and we're all praying that it happens. But got to temper this with a couple of other facts. HIV is the virus that causes AIDS. That emerged in the late 70s, early 80s. We have been desperately searching for a vaccine for that virus for more than 40 years. Still haven't found one. And coronavirus is not a new virus. This is a new strain of virus, but we've had coronaviruses around for years. 25% of all head colds are caused by a coronavirus. And in all of that experience, we have not yet come up with a vaccine for any of those other strains.
So there you have it.
And by the way, vaccine is simply an artificial way of inducing herd immunity. And it is very clear that has already been achieved in the countries that didn't lock down, like Sweden, like Netherlands. And again, the attack on Sweden was, well, their mortality rate's so high. Their mortality rate now is equivalent to the United States. The only difference is most of the states in this country destroyed their economies. Sweden took some economic damage because of what was going on in the rest of Europe, but nothing like we've seen here. And as I said, the Netherlands is at 4% unemployment right now.
Yeah, and we've taken it, as you described, because of our policy, we've now extended the pain of this far out longer. It's got the equivalent of pulling a Band-Aid off slowly than just ripping it off, right? I mean, Sweden went quickly there.
Yeah.
Well,
and at the end of the day, same mortality rate. Mm-hmm. They're within a couple per million right now of the U.S. rate.
Yeah, fascinating. We've got, well, this is probably going to be one of the preeminent issues on people's minds as they go into the ballot boxes.
It ought to be. There's never been a period where more freedom has been taken from people in a shorter period of time without a vote over the pretext that they might catch a virus that's going around. Mm-hmm. And again, this is not the bubonic plague. It's not even Ebola. It is a virus that is a threat to the elderly. I mean, I've got an 89-year-old mother. She's been a hermit. She still lives by herself. I tell folks she's 89 going on 59, and it's true. But she's had to be cooped up in her house now for 6 months because she is elderly and therefore at risk. And she goes to such measures as taking, when she brings in the mail every day, she puts on gloves, she brings in the mail, she lays it out on the kitchen counter and then sprays it with disinfectant. That's how careful she's being. If she was living in Sweden, she wouldn't need to worry about that. The mortality there has been over for months now.
Wow.
But she's got to worry about it in California because Gavin Newsom, in addition to destroying our economy, prolonged this agony far, far beyond those states and those countries that simply sheltered their elderly and then coped with it.
There was debate on a national level about the need for another federal stimulus or bailout package, similar to the CARES Act, right? Now, of course, the Democrats were lobbying for something like a $3.3 trillion new bill, and I think the Republicans were countering with somewhere around a $1 trillion bill.
Which means they'll compromise at $5 trillion.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the motives behind the parties as to why it's may or may not necessary, because I'm a little bit skeptical that it might just be a little opportunistic.
Oh, it's very opportunistic.
Put a bunch of funds
together. It funds the entire Democratic social agenda,
okay,
under the guise of response to COVID-19. But I supported the main CARES package and its supplement, because I felt it was absolutely essential for the 2 weeks to flatten the curve that we kept our jobs liquid. So that people had jobs to go back to.
Right.
But I warned at the time two things. Number one, COVID-19 didn't do this, government policies did this. And number two, there is absolutely no substitute for reopening the economy right away. I said this back in March. And the reason for that is the government cannot support the economy for any period of time, any appreciable period of time, because the government does not fund the economy. There seems to be this inclination among the left to say, well, the government will just send you all free money. Well, it doesn't work that way. Government doesn't finance the economy. The economy finances the government. And when you shut down the economy, you shut down the revenues going to government. So we don't have a penny of what we're doling out in trillion-dollar dollops. Now think about $1 trillion. That's $8,000 for every family in this country. We don't have that money, so we borrow it. We borrow it from the future. We borrow it, first of all, we borrow it in the present. We borrow it from the same capital pool that would otherwise be available to loan to businesses that are seeking to stay afloat or to loan to consumers seeking to make purchases. That money's no longer there because government's now borrowed it, but it has to be repaid in the future. So think of $1 trillion as $8,000 just added to your credit card bill. So $3 trillion bailout, which is what the original CARES, I think, CARES package, well, and something was about $3 trillion.
Yeah.
That's $24,000 added to your credit card bill, and that's real money. It's just as real as if it appeared on your credit card bill, because you're going to have to pay back that $24,000 as an average family through your future taxes. So what we're doing is killing our future by prolonging these lockdowns. It is not government aid that is the problem. The lockdown is the problem, and the lockdowns never should have happened in the first place, and have gone on to such an extreme that I am afraid it's going to take us many, many years to recover.
You make a very good point there that voters ought to probably take into the ballot box with them this November, that if they should they be casting their vote to end the lockdowns or to get a check in the mail as a bailout, right? I mean, that's
one of the problems in the CARES package we had to swallow to get the liquidity was the fact that we were paying most people more money not to work than they had been making working. In fact, I had a friend who lives in Phoenix. His son worked at a community center, was getting $3,000 a month check from the government for this this entry-level job he had. And he said, and the kid's like 16, 17 years old, he says, I'm not sure I'm going to let him keep that. And I said, well, you ought to let him keep it because he's going to be paying it back over the rest of his life.
That's right.
No, I mean, the self-defeating things, one of the things I'm attacked for is voting against what's called the Families First Act. You have to understand what that did. That mandated every small business that now lost all of their income. It mandated them to keep on their payroll for 90 days anybody claiming a COVID-related absence. 90 days when they have no income coming in. I voted against that. It passed and was signed into law. And what happened was 4.5 million people lost their jobs between the time it was signed into law and the time that it took effect, because all of those small businesses were saying, we don't want to let these people go. We want to try to hang on. But if we have them after the effective date of this bill, we're going to have to pay them for 90 days. We're going to have to front that money for 90 days and hope we can get it back. When we've got no cash flow, we can't do that. 4.5 million people lost their jobs that week.
Wow.
Because of that, largely because of that bill. That's the kind of lunacy that's been going on in Washington.
Yeah.
And as I said, the government cannot support the economy. It is the economy that supports the government.
Well, you're making it abundantly clear that the problems we're experiencing here are self-inflicted bad policy.
Yep.
And they are not exactly healthcare or viral related.
I've reflected on that Hippocratic maxim, do no harm. First, do no harm. That is the fundamental principle dating back to the days of Hippocrates in medicine. Whatever you do for a patient, first do no harm. Think about the enormous harm that these lockdowns have done. And it is heartbreaking, particularly when you compare them to those countries that kept level-headed, or for that matter, those states that kept level-headed, didn't lock down. They've suffered a fraction of the economic damage, and they actually have overall lower rates of mortality.
Congressman, do no harm. You always bring wisdom to us, and you're leaving us with a very wise maxim there. So, Congressman McClintock, thank you very much for joining us again on Inside View. To our viewers, thank you for watching. I hope you found these episodes worthwhile and that you've learned something. So, I'm Cory Burnell. I'll see you next time on Inside View.